Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder where you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Constance Meadors. And so I'm here today because I heard you were having an Engineering Stars Day. And I want to speak to you just a little bit about what it takes to become an engineering star. So when I was listening to her talk about the person that was coming on this stage, I was thinking, who is that? Is that me? And amazingly, I guess that is me. I'm here. I came on after her. I want you to know that it is an honor to be here, and I want you to know that I had a very humble beginning. So as we're talking about that, think about the Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. How many of you all know Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? I've heard that. Absolutely. I started to tell you to actually go through it with me, but I was like, they may not. I know how you all are sometimes. So that was a nursery rhyme that I heard as a child. And so as I'm thinking about it, we are diamonds in the sky. You are diamonds in the sky. So what is a star? I want to talk about what is a star. You know, we think about stars and they are bright, but stars are brought together by forces. They're particles brought together by forces. And when we think about who we are particles brought together by forces. If you think about your individual lives, and collectively you come together, you can be a star as a team, or you can be a star as an individual. But we all are stars. And what are the forces? Excuse me. Various forces. Sometimes there are positive forces that bring us together, and sometimes there are negative forces that bring us together. But when you think about who you are and what you are a star. And so I want to tell you and walk you through the process of engineering design, designing a star, engineering tomorrow's engineers today, engineering tomorrow's stars today. So ask. The first step is to ask. If you wanted to know about the engineering design project, or if you wanted to know about the process for the scientific method, the first thing we do is we ask. So you can ask, who am I, or what am I? A few years back, I asked the question. I said, am I the exception or am I the rule? And I said, according to statistics, I should not be a black female doing science like me. Am I the exception or am I the rule? I said, according to the X chromosome and melanin in my skin, there's no way I should be doing science from within. I ask, am I the exception or am I the rule? I said, coming from a hood, coming from a single mother, coming from places unlike any other, am I the exception or am I the rule? I said, poverty didn't stop me from getting not one, not two, but 3 STEM degrees. Am I the exception or am I the rule? So I want you to ask yourself, who are you? Are you the exception or are you the rule? I came to the conclusion that I am not the exception, that I am the rule, and the rule needs to be changed. And that's when I launched #ChangeTheRule. And it began to change my life and hopefully the lives of many others. So ask yourself, who are you? Or, I said, imagine. So I want you to stop and take a moment to look at this picture. And imagine. So Dr. Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. We also had the song, Imagine. Do you know who that little girl is in that picture? I thought I heard someone. It's me, standing with my grandmother. So I always said, I never imagined that I would ever be working for NASA. Never imagined that I would ever be doing science. Never imagined that I would be a rocket scientist. So I want you to take a look at this picture, a very old picture. You can tell by the cars. You see the little girl standing back there. Does she look afraid? So I do not know what was in my mind at that time. But what I do know was that I had the things I needed to become that person and to address the questions I may have had. And I want you to think about, as you think about who you are, and as you're looking at life and whether or not you have the ability to major in STEM or to be a STEM engineer or some person that works at NASA, that imagine that little girl. Does that little girl represent you? Imagine that woman. Does that woman represent someone in your life? So I grew up in a very small rural town in Louisiana in 3 generations. So I grew up in a household with my grandmother and my mother, and as I said in the poem, my mother had me as a teenager. So imagine, I never thought I would be here speaking to you. I want to make this a little bit more realistic. Now I want you to look at what you see here. And you see these walls, and you see the shelves on the wall. So why would I put this in a presentation, and especially if I'm talking about NASA and coming from NASA? I walked into a classroom one day with some students I was doing some after-school work with, and I said, I want you to imagine what we can do at your school. And so imagine if your teacher said, okay, we're going to design a science museum. And then if the person came in and they said, we're going to allow you to take this room and transform it into whatever you want to. And now you can create. But I gave them some limits. I said it had to have moving parts. It had to be relative to NASA. And they had to be able to present it. And we had $0 budget. No budget. So that meant they had to figure out how to bring in things by themselves. Do you think you could do that? If your teacher said, I'm going to give you this whole classroom, what could you do? So the first step that we did was we had to plan. And so as we begin to plan, this is my vision board. So I want you to see that. Because I think sometimes we don't think we should have a vision. You are not too young to have a vision. So one of the first steps we had to do was plan. On my vision board, this is the most recent vision board, and now I'm actually upgrading it. Every year I revise it. But I had NASA on there. I had to be most influential in STEM. I had my company. I had different things. So think about what your vision would look like if you were planning. And if you had it in your idea, your mind, that you were going to go to NASA, or something else you may want to do. If you wanted to be a researcher, if you wanted to work for a space grant. How many of you have created a vision board? Nobody? I see 1 or 2 hands. How many of you have considered creating a vision board? It is impactful. Create a vision board. I did a vision board. This was something that I did after I did the hashtag change the rule, after I wrote the poem. So with my students that I was working with, here's the plan. What I did was we came in, and so we were going to do a rocket, we were going to do a space shuttle. And so these were the plans that the students gave us. And so different students gave me plans. They had to come out and we had to actually do it to scale. And as we were doing this to scale, we had to think about how we would take that room, how we would transform that room. But we were planning. And so we would go in and we'd walk the room, we would walk around, but we were planning. So while I was at NASA, what I realized was that I had to plan. I would come in and I had to plan projects. So you heard her tell you that I was one of the first persons to be the intergovernmental personnel assignee for Meadors. Some of the things we did as part of our planning was we would write white papers. We looked at how to involve minority-serving institutions or underrepresented students in STEM programs and in NASA programs. And then I would go out and I would look at how to lead that. And we would look at how to plan. But I had to first imagine these things. So I would imagine how to be creative. And I would look at how could we do this. So what I want you to think about is if you were given that opportunity, what would your plan look like? You are not too young to plan, and it's never too early to plan. And so some of the activities that we planned was you are in an EPSCoR jurisdiction, going to the EPSCoR jurisdictions or going to the states that did not have as much research and working with them, working with their students. And you can't be afraid to plan. Plan to win. So you notice I have purple on today, and I told you I was from Louisiana. Go LSU. Plan to win. Don't let the world count you out. The next thing was we had to create. So as I talk about my personal creations, I want you to think about if you were a star, or if you wanted to be a star, what would you do to create that? You all have gadgets. You all have things that you work with. How would you create that? What would you do next? What would you do in your life to create and take you where you wanted to be? So here's what we did. For me, to be able to be successful and to continue to create, I had to think outside the box. I had to network. I had to work with the NASA people, so I had to work with the NASA engineers. I had to work with the NASA scientists. But in order to create with my students and the team, when we were building and designing this museum on a budget, what do you think we did? What would you do as a student if you were creating? How would you move forward? So here are a few things that the students did. They brought in things from home. They brought in activities. I had some students bring in stoves, pieces of stoves. I had some students bring in parts of a car, but we were being creative. And as we continued to create, the next thing we had to do was we had to test. So as we were working and we had to test, how do you think we designed our test? So here's how we designed our test. Part of the way that we designed the test was, one, we actually took part of chicken wire and we built a space shuttle. Can you imagine building a space shuttle out of chicken wire? Another thing we had to do was, as we were trying to test, is then we took little bitty fans and we built the back of the space shuttle. How many of you know what a solar eclipse is? Okay, great. You know what a solar eclipse is. How many of you know what a disco ball is? Oh, you don't know what a disco ball, okay. So can you imagine, as part of your plan, taking a disco ball and making it into a solar eclipse setup? No. So what we did, hopefully my slides will come back up, is we took a wall, we covered it and painted it in black, and we took a disco ball, and as it turned, we put it on that wall, and as part of that, we had it covered, and as it began to turn, it reflected and it looked like a solar eclipse on the wall. That's part of being creative and your imagining and your plan. So once we did that, then we looked at how could we build the space shuttle. So we took, and we'd have prototypes. And so what I had students do was we took dimensions. And as we were doing the dimensions, then we took pieces of paper. And we were then rolling it around. So from that, as we were doing this, as we were building the individual ones and we were designing, then the next thing we did was we did a prototype, and the prototype was of a space shuttle. And from the space shuttle prototype, then the next thing we did was we took it and we placed it on a wall. A life size, as big as we could on the wall. So that was our test. So here's Create. So here's what we did with Create. And I want you to think about this because I'm coming to you as a person who's worked at NASA. But what I want you to understand in this process and the steps and the things that I'm doing and I did with these students was part of my process of getting to NASA. It was part of some of the things that I had to do because I stepped out. And after doing #ChangeTheRule and asking, am I the exception or am I the rule, I said, what am I going to do to show that I'm the rule? So I didn't decide, oh, I can't do things or the world has counted me out. I decided that yes, I can do things, I will do things, and I will do things where I am. So as part of Create, here's what we did. Up in the top right corner, do you know or do you recognize what that is? I see yes. It's what? Children. So do you remember a long time ago they had the game where you would actually have to go in and you could pick out like a bone or pick up and you would try not to shock? Operation. See, I knew I'd get somebody to say it. So as part of, we built an operation game. But that operation game was an astronaut. And remember that in the create part and in the plan part, I gave them some instructions. And the instructions was that it had to be or had to have some kind of working or moving part. And we had 4 teams. And so the 4 teams each had a wall. And on one wall, they all could do what they wanted to on their wall. So one team decided to do the operation. The other team was building the space shuttle. And so what we were doing was we were looking. And so in the bottom, in the create, that's a prototype. I said, you have to do a prototype. And the other team, as they did the operation, we did all of this out of things from home. So I want you to think about that. You could do this at your school or at your home. And so this was part of being creative. How can you take what you have and where you are and do science and do STEM? Because some people think you have to have a lot. Next slide, please. So then we talked about test. What I want you to see in this slide was as we were preparing and you had to do a test. So we're going through the engineering design process. So as your engineering stars. So then the very next thing was, how do you test what you have? What I want you to recognize is in the very bottom corner, that's a flight simulator that the students built. So that was their wall. They decided they wanted to be able to do a flight simulator as if they were an astronaut or a pilot training. And so that was their test. So here's what I want you to ask yourself. How are you tested in life? And we all should be tested. So if you think about how you are tested, sometimes you may be that it is a test in school, or it may be you have to test yourself. I test myself all the time to improve, to do better. So that's what we were doing. Next slide, please. And here's what we have. So remember I told you about doing a space shuttle? And we said a space shuttle on a dime. So I want you to see what we have here. This was done with students. This was a process because I wanted to introduce these students to NASA. I wanted them to have an idea. And I wanted it to be something that even NASA would say, wow. So what we did was we took paper. We had a prototype. You see the black wall in the very back in the top slide? We took and we covered the wall with black paper. Here we have the space shuttle. The little red things are fans. So we had little bitty fans that we wired. Remember, everything had to have a moving part. We wanted it to be able to do something. Then we had underneath that paper is chicken wire. Why chicken wire? Because these were students that were actually working at an ag school, and they lived in a rural area. So they knew, and they had chicken wire at home. And so that's what they brought. So they brought in things they had. And so then the test was, how could we get these parts to work? How could we get these things to move? How could we make this be successful? So I want you to stop and think about, how can you be successful? How can you get to that point you want to be at? And don't let it be a case of, this is what I want to do, but the world tells me I can't. Because remember, I told you that you're not the exception, you are the rule. We just have to change the rules as we go. And to do that, then that's how you become a star. Next slide, please. And then we improved. And so this is where we said good, better, best. When I was growing up, we used to say good, better, best, put you to the test. We improved. And so you see at the top right there, and you see that you have the space shuttle. Does that look like a real space shuttle? Does it come close to looking like a real space shuttle? So it does not look exactly like a real space shuttle because it's not built exactly to scale, and it's not exactly what it should be, but it came close, and that's what we wanted it to do. We wanted it to actually be a resemblance. That space shuttle is hanging on the wall. We put it on the wall. So we did a science center, and so that is the same space shuttle that we were designing. And so we wanted it to look like it was in space, so then we said, let's put something over here that makes it look like it's in space. And so this was part of how we improve. And what I want you to think about is at NASA, we're always working to improve our systems, to improve our programs, to improve the things we're doing, and we should always be working to improve. I always work to improve. You should always be working to improve. So we started off with our prototype, we started off with our design, and then we moved through. And this is what was done at a school as part of a NASA project. Next slide, please. And so what I want you to realize is that you are a star. You are a star. And as we're moving through and thinking about, you are a star. And the reason I have these students up here in the corner is because even though we were doing this project, where we ended was, then next, they were moved on, and we ended up on TV, and we ended up being highlighted, and we ended up being recognized for the work they were doing. And so that's what we want you to understand, that when we're doing work at NASA, or when you're doing work here at your institution, and you're doing things at your school, that you are moving toward becoming a star. That you are designing and engineering and becoming, and so you're going through those processes. You're going through the engineering design process. If you are in a robotics club, if you're doing some work, then remember you are going through those processes and that you are a star. And an example was when I was doing the Courageous Conversation. I came to NASA and I said, I want to do a courageous conversation, and I want it to be a Juneteenth emancipation celebration. Most people had never heard of Juneteenth, and they surely were not aware of what Juneteenth and emancipation process was. But they allowed me to do it because I asked first. That was the first thing I did, was I asked. And we did it. And even though there was some question or some doubts as we went through the process, they allowed me to do it. And we had glitches, even like this. My system went out at one point. However, the very next day, after doing the Juneteenth, the president announced Juneteenth as a national holiday. I did not know that. But I followed my passion, and I asked, and I planned, and I created. Next slide, please. And so I want you to see here, and I don't know, this probably when I play, but it says, students use small budget to create out of this world museum. And so this is what we did as part of doing work, doing STEM, doing process for NASA. And these are the students, and they were featured on the news. They were featured around. And if you can see, this was the idea of the space shuttle. In the background, you see the black. Those are actually black plastic tablecloths. Remember, they had a small budget. But they were stars, and we were creating stars. Next slide, please. And so I want to say thank you. Thank you for allowing me to come speak to you. Thank you for allowing me to share and hopefully inspire and show you some ways that you can bring things to your school and your institution. And I wanted you to be aware that I am moving on. I'm doing things that I want to be able to continue to do things that will inspire you all and the things that took me to NASA as I was working. Thank you. Any questions? So what we had them doing was they all had, instead of just building fans that were plugged in, each system had to be individual. And so what we had them do was they had to be able to wire. So they learned some electronics along the way. And so they had to be able to wire the fans and then have little batteries to them. Yes? I didn't hear you. When did the museum end? So you know it's a school year, probably, I would say maybe about 6 months. Yep, we started off at first, we did little CAD designs, and I didn't show you everything because I didn't want to go through all of, but what we did was we started off with little bitty things. We walked through, and I wanted to make sure they understood the prototype design process. And then as we went through, we then started staying after school, working a little longer, and they were being dismissed out of class. And so that was some of the things. And I would say probably about 6 months that we did. And then we were featured, and then what we did was we opened it up and allowed students to come in. They got to test the flight simulator. We had someone donate an actual flight simulator. So then once we had built it, instead of them trying to design something, we had that in. And then they ran the space shuttle part. And then we had another side where we had the wall where it was the solar eclipse piece. And then we had another side where it was another wall where the students were actually showing models from NASA. Yes?
Hi, I was wondering what one of your favorite, least favorite classes was when you was in middle school or high school.
Favorite or least favorite? So at one point, science became my favorite. But here's what I need to tell you about myself, that I repeated the first grade. So that means it does not matter where you start. I started off, and in the first grade, I was held back. Then at some point, I got involved in science fair projects. And that's why I really push these type of things. When I go around, I push students being engaged and doing hands-on. And then finally, someone got me involved in a science fair project, and I loved it. I enjoyed it. We were traveling. We were doing things. We didn't have all the things that you all have now. We didn't have social media. So if I wanted to do research, I had to go to the library, do research. If I wanted information, I had to write and request the information and then wait for the packet to come back and then go through it. And when we did our science fair boards, we had to build them out of wood and paint them. We couldn't go to the store and buy a cardboard. We had to build it. So in terms of my least favorite or favorite class, science became my favorite class because we were doing fun things. I'm sorry. We were doing fun things, for one, and also I was getting out of class. I have to be honest about that, because when we were doing science projects, we got to miss class. We could go into the other classrooms and say, oh, I have to go work on my science fair project, so I have to be, and the teachers would be like, oh, okay, and they'd let us leave. And then probably one of my least favorite classes was probably maybe English and history, because I got to the point I didn't want to read and write, honestly.
Let's give a round of applause.